So we're on part 2 of chapter 18, Social Psychology by David Myers, 8th edition. So we're going to look at group influence. How do groups affect our behavior? Social psychologists look at various things. They look at a person affecting another, families, teams, and committees. So when we look at people affecting others, we look at social facilitation. So this refers to actually having like an improved performance when you're present of other people. This is why they tell you people like to work out with other people, because what we noticed is that people start competing against each other and they start working and they start actually going faster. So what they did here was they took cyclists and they looked at their race times, and when they competed against each other, they actually did better than just competing against the clock. So social loafing is the tendency of an individual in a group to exert less effort towards obtaining some sort of common goal than when they're actually tested individually. This is why people hate group projects, because in group projects you have a social loafer, a person who does absolutely nothing. And it's because they're not going to be singled out in the experiment. When we look at de-individualization, this is the loss of self-awareness and self-restraint when you're in a group situation, because the group situation seems to like have this mob mentality and anonymity. So you're not going to be well known and you don't really know who you are. You lose that awareness and you lose all your social strengths. So then we look at group polarization, and group polarization is just enhancing a group's prevailing attitudes through a discussion. So when you actually start discussing, what you notice is that like-minded people strengthen their attitude and their opinions on a topic. And so they'll start actually putting themselves in a group. So if a group is pretty like-minded, the discussion will only just strengthen their viewpoint. In groupthink, a mode of thinking that occurs when the desire for harmony in a decision-making group overrides a realistic appraisal of some sort of alternative. So there was a groupthink on the attack on Pearl Harbor. There were some people that said, whoa, let's not do it. Same thing with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Watergate cover-up, and like the Chernobyl reactor accident. So we look at the power of an individual. We look at Gandhi. Gandhi did like nonviolent fasts, and because he did these nonviolent fasts, he eventually got India to be independent from the British. So the power of the individual is actually very powerful. It's significant. So the power of social influence is enormous, but so is your individual power that you all yield. So social psychologists, so social relations, they look at prejudice, aggression, conflict to attraction, altruism, and peacemaking. So they look at how we actually relate to each other through these things. So when we look at prejudice, the best definition of it is prejudgment. Excuse me. And prejudgment or prejudice is just, normally it's unjustifiable, and normally it's very negative. So it's unjustifiable, and normally it is a highly negative attitude towards a group and its members. So prejudice is it can be done towards a cultural group, it could be ethnicity, it could be gender groups. And so components of prejudice would be like beliefs, emotions, predispositions to act. And so we look at stereotypes, hostility, and we even look at the way people discriminate against each other. And so when you look at prejudice, it works at the conscious level, so people are aware of it. But it also works maybe more at the unconscious level. There are people who, they're not real certain why they're upset with someone or why they're angry with this group of people. They just know that, maybe they are. They're not real certain what the root cause of it is. So how prejudiced are people? Really, over time, prejudice has decreased. More people are actually accepting of things like interracial marriage, gender, homosexuality, and really minorities has actually decreased over time. So Americans today express much less racial and gender prejudice than they did, 50, 60 years ago. And because Americans are experiencing, less prejudice, we're open to more things. When we look at race, 9 out of 10 white respondents were slow when responding to the words like peace or paradise when they saw a black individual's photo compared to a white individual's photo. And this kind of tells us that racism or prejudice is kind of at the unconscious level. When we look at gender, a lot of women still live in poverty, and women are still making less than men. So when you look at this, you kind of still see gender prejudice. And you see this particularly in China and India, where same-sex abortions are selected abortion. It might be outlawed. It's still going on, though, in places like in India. In one village in India, they don't have any females. They have like all males because of the sex selection abortion. When we look at gender, although prejudice prevails against women, more people actually feel positive towards women than men. And so when you make a man's picture more feminized, when you kind of make him more look more girl-like, what ends up happening is people actually like him a little bit better. And when we look at social roots of prejudice, so there's social inequities, there's social division, and there's normally an emotional scapegoat. And so you blame people, and this is what ends up happening. So social inequity, what happens is people might have money, they might have power, they might have prestige, and some people don't. And because of that, it's going to cause a social inequality that increases prejudice, which increases your dislike of a group. We have in-group and out-group. In-group are people with whom one shares a common identity. And out-group are those that are perceived as different from one's own in-group. So my in-group, I'm a female, it would be my in-group is females. I share a common identity with other females. My out-group would be guys. Guys and I, we have a different group, you know. So in-group bias, I tend to favor females over guys because that's my in-group bias. So you can look at the Scottish fans, it would be the same way. So emotional roots of prejudice. Prejudice provides an outlet for anger. People just want somebody to blame, and they don't care who they blame. So a lot of Arab Americans were really kind of abused and hurt after 9/11 because people were so angry about 9/11, they just kind of lashed out at Arab Americans. So when we look at the cognitive roots of prejudice, one way we simplify our world is to categorize things. And this might be why people like categorize things and categorize groups of people, and this might lead to us stereotyping them. So we categorize people into groups by stereotyping. And when we look at like vivid cases of prejudice, so in vivid cases such as 9/11 attacks, terrorists can feed stereotypes and prejudice. And so most terrorists are non-Muslim. When you actually look at terrorism, and please understand terrorism is just something as old as mankind. Most people who are terrorists are not Muslim. There are other groups or there are other things. But because 9/11 put it in your head, people felt that all terrorists, were Muslim, and that's not true at all. And cognitive roots of prejudice, so the tendency of people to believe that the world is just, and this is the just world phenomenon. And what this means is you believe people deserve what they get, and that's just how life is for you. So people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. So if you got hit by a car because you were jaywalking, somebody who believes in this just world phenomenon will be like, well, that's what she gets for crossing the road without looking. Nobody deserves to get hit by a car, but this is that kind of thing. Hindsight bias. So after learning an outcome, the tendency to believe that we could have predicted it beforehand may contribute to blaming the victim and forming a prejudice against them. This is like when the people on the news goes, I guess she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, of course you can say that you were at the wrong place at the wrong time when this gas station got held up. But who knew the gas station would get held up? Because if you knew and you didn't tell anyone, then you're just as guilty as the person who held it up. So aggression can be any physical or verbal behavior intended to hurt or destroy. So if you want to lash out at someone because you want to hurt them, it could be psychologically, it could be physically, then that is aggression. So it may be done reactively because you're hostile. It could be as a proactive way. Some people use aggression as a weapon to get what they want. And so we look at the biology of aggression. There's genetics, there's neural, and there's biochemical influences here. When we look at genetic, we do look at some animals have actually been bred for sport and for aggression. A pit bull is an aggressive animal. It is bred for protecting the home. Now, it might not be aggressive to its owners, but it does have an aggressive genetic background. Now, neural influences, some centers in our brains, particularly the limbic system with the amygdala, remember angry, and the frontal lobe might actually be involved with aggression. So maybe you have less activity in the frontal lobe, maybe your amygdala is increased. So these would be our neural influences. When we look at biochemical influences, if you actually castrate an animal, they'll become docile because the testosterone level is not there, and testosterone is associated with aggression. So as testosterone increases, so does aggression. And so prenatal exposure to testosterone can increase aggression in the female hyenas. So we look at the psychology of aggression. So dealing with aversive events, learning aggression is rewarding, and observing models of aggression, acquiring a social script. So sometimes people use aggression as that weapon to get what they want. So when we look at aversive situations or aversive events, studies in which animals and humans experience unpleasant events reveal that those made miserable often like to make other people miserable. So when you're in a bad mood, you like to put other people in a bad mood as well. Now, environment. Your environment can also contribute. What we notice is that when it's really hot, murders and rapes actually increase. Violent acts do increase. It's like on a hot day when you're driving, there are actually going to probably be more accidents and more aggressive driving incidents on that day because of the temperature. Frustration aggression principle. A principle in which frustration caused by blocking of an attempt to achieve a desired goal creates anger, which generates our aggression. So learning that aggression is rewarding. If you get what you want by being angry, then people will continue to do it. So if you get your desired outcome, people tend to learn that that's the way that things work, and so they continue to do it. So cultures that favor violence breed violence. So the Scottish settlers in the South have more violent tendencies than their pacifist Quaker Dutch in the northeast of the United States. When we observe models of aggression, sexually coercive men are promiscuous and hostile in their relationships with women, and this coerciveness is increased due to television viewing of like R and X-rated movies. So when people see that movies and stuff are being overly aggressive, they actually start mimicking it. And you don't have to believe me, but remember Bandura did a whole social psychology experiment on people actually observing behaviors of them beating up Bobo and people actually doing it. We also have social scripts. So the media portrays social scripts and generates mental tapes in the minds of the viewer. So when confronted with any new situation, individuals might go back to that social script. It's like a Hollywood actor, he doesn't know how to tell her he loves her, so he goes back to a movie that he made that was a romantic movie and quotes something from the romantic movie to tell his new lady love, I love you. That's that social script, like, are you talking to me? Are you talking to me? People do this all the time. Well, De Niro made it famous. But it's a social script that people actually enact. So do video games teach or release violence? The general consensus on violent video games is that to some extent they do breed violence. I mean, like, some of these video games are pretty realistic. And adolescents view the world as hostile when they get into arguments and they receive bad grades after playing such games. So when you play a very violent game and then something bad happens to you, they actually see things as more aggressive than they would have if they hadn't watched it. So we look at the biological, psychological, and social cultural influence again. So now we're going to look at conflict. Conflict is perceived as an incompatibility of actions, goals, or ideas. So we look at a social trap. This is a situation in which a person has these conflicting parties and they're trying to rationally pursue their self-interest, and because they're trying to pursue their self-interest, they become caught in some mutually destructive behavior. So you're trying to go after what you want, but your parties, what's going on is actually conflicting at the moment. So a game of social traps. So by pursuing our own self-interest and not trusting others, we tend to end up losers. So you do what's best for you and you never trust anyone else, you're not going to be very successful in life in social psychology. So we look at enemy perception. So people in conflict typically form diabolical images of one another. So Saddam Hussein called, President Bush wicked pharaoh, and President Bush called Saddam Hussein, axis of evil. But it's easier to make someone a diabolical image than to try and see him as a human being who might actually be misunderstood, or maybe you need to deal with it in another perspective or another way. So who are we attracted to? Proximity. Typically, we are attracted to people who are close to us. And so this is who we're friends with and who we actually get attracted to. And this is what we call the mere exposure effect. After being exposed to that guy for 50 times, you're actually going to start liking the guy a little bit more. I know Bob in one of my history classes. I hated Bob. But after having Bob in 3 of my history classes at ECU, you just get adjusted to Bob in the room. It's not that you liked Bob, but at least you knew what Bob was going to ask in every single class. So psychology of attraction, we look at physical attractiveness. So once proximity affords contact, the next most important thing is actually how people look. So, you can tell because politicians and actors and actresses, they get plastic surgery all the time. Similarity. Similar views among individuals cause the bond of attraction to strengthen. I know you guys think opposites attract, but it's actually similarity that will keep the relationship going. When we look at passionate love, we're looking at an aroused state of intense positive absorption in another person. And normally this is at the beginning of a love relationship. And there's two factors that contribute to it: physical arousal plus some sort of cognitive appraisal. And then arousal from any source can enhance one's emotion depending upon what we interpret or labeled arousal. So when we look at companionate love, it's a deep affection and attachment that we feel for another person that we're intertwined with. And when we look at altruism, what it's talking about is equity and self-disclosure. I don't want to stop here, and we're going to have to go to part 3 for social psych.